This is from Island Magic by Elizabeth Goudge, and it is Chapter 6. Christmas Day at Bon Repos was something terrific. The Dufrocks took the whole of December preparing for it, and the whole of January recovering from it. From love of old association, they kept up all the old Yuletide customs, and to be abreast of the times, they added to them the modern English customs, and to both, they added strenuous religious observances. That they did not all collapse completely must be put down to the sustaining power of the island air. At the beginning of December, Rachel and Sophie began to be frantically busy making puddings and pies and cakes, while the children, planted out in corners of rooms, behind sheltering barricades of furniture, made each other astounding presents in an atmosphere of secrecy and excitement thick enough to be cut with a knife. The fever point of preparation was reached on the morning of Christmas Eve. Everyone was amazingly punctual at breakfast and amazingly anxious to get through with it and start decorating. The day before, armfuls of holly had been cut from the hedges and put ready in an enormous pile on the hall floor, each smooth leaf and polished berry holding a gay reflection of the sunlight in its gleaming little mirror. For the weather was obliging, a clear, sparkling, blue-washed sky and sea, winter trees purple in the shadows, and a rosy brown where the sun touched them. Tawny winter grass crested with white frost in the early morning, and crystal drops at midday, and here and there, in sheltered folds of the cliff, a few scattered flowers of the golden gorse. The rocks beside the little crisply breaking waves were quite warm to the touch, and the rock sparrows, flitting from crimson seaweed-covered boulder to yellow lichened cliff, were chattering as though it were spring. The robins were everywhere. There were 3 in the Bon Repos garden, hopping up and down the moss-grown path where the Canterbury bells grew in summer, chirping brazenly at the front door, cheeking the hens at the back door, and boldly following Sophie into the kitchen to demand their Christmas largesse of crumbs and bacon rind. And they got it, for Sophie, like all islanders, looked upon the robins as sacred birds. It was the robin who first brought fire to the island. Flying across the sea with a torch in his beak, he burnt his breast, but on he flew, undaunted, a little suffering speck of a bird lost between sea and sky. When he arrived at the island, with his breast feathers burnt and raw and red, all the other birds were so sorry for him that they each gave him a feather, except the owl, who, selfish creature, would not, and in consequence no longer dares to show his face in the island by day. The decorating of the house with greenery and the wrapping up of all the presents kept Bon Repos in a hubbub all the morning. Rachel sailed serenely about her household duties, picking her way through balls of string, streamers of colored paper, mountains of greenery, pots of paint required by Colin for some mysterious present he was making for his father, Maximilian running around in circles with his tongue out, and all the children tearing up and down stairs, half crazy with excitement. Nothing seemed to disturb her tranquility, but André and Renouf had long since fled to the comparative peace of the farmyard. Colette, to be out of harm's way, was shut in the kitchen with Sophie, where she sat in a fat heap on the floor, breathing deeply and making dough babies with currant eyes and gingerbread animals of no recognizable breed. Marmalade, the pagan creature, had gone mousing in the barn. She had no religious sense, and the great festivals of the church left her quite cold. In this she differed from Maximilian, who was a devout dog. He always went to the stable at midnight on Christmas Eve and knelt side by side in the sweet hay with the cattle, and he listened very politely indeed, with his tongue out, when his family sang carols on Christmas Day. Lunch consisted of cold meat and bread and all the remnants of last week's puddings heaped together in a dish and disguised beneath custard. This menu, resorted to by Sophie in moments of stress, usually produced an indignant outcry, but today, so great was the general goodwill, it was quite favorably received. Colin actually demanded a second helping of pudding, and that, though his first, beneath its yellow blanket, had contained a spoonful of tapioca, his particular detestation, a square inch of treacle tart, a slab of blancmange, and the stones of 3 prunes now defunct. After-lunch hats and coats were put on, and André brought round the landau, for they were all going into St. Pierre. André, Rochelle, Michel, and Peronelle were going to confession. Sophie was going gallivanting with Jacquemin Gosselin, and Ranulph had promised to take the 3 younger children to look at the Christmas sights. The journey into St. Pierre took a long time for Lupin to find the weight of the entire household, including Sophie in her stays and an electric blue coat and skirt and a scarlet hat, so preposterous that André, Ranulph, and Colin had to get out and walk at every tiniest slope. But who minded? The air, sun-warmed yet cool and fresh as seawater, seemed to run through their veins like frosted fire. And all around them, the world lay twinkling in a hushed expectancy of miracle, jeweled and glowing and palpitant, rich with stored treasure, yet held back by the fingers of the frost, from the giving and the bursting and the shouting of the spring. Yet, though the spring of the earth was far distant, the spring of birth was in their hearts. And inwardly, beneath all the excitement and the fun, they adored and worshipped. Even Ranulph, who did not believe a word of the Christmas legend, and André, who was doubtful, caught the infection, and for the moment were among the worshippers. St. Pierre was reached at last, and Lupin, heaving his flanks with relief, was unharnessed and established at his inn. His family bade him goodbye affectionately, and pursued their way down the hill, separating at the foot of the steps leading to St. Raphael's. Sophie, her face purple from the tightness of her stays and the nip of the frost in the air, went to La Rue Clubon to find Jacquemin Gosselin and Ranulph with Colette clinging to his hand, and Jacqueline and Colin, dancing in front of him, went downhill to the town. "Let's go to the La Rue Clubon," chirped Colin. "We are in charge of 2 fair ladies," Ranulph reminded him. "What does it take, ladies, to La Rue Clubon?" Colin looked over his shoulder and, meeting Ranulph's twinkling eyes, perceived dimly that men and women, inhabiting the same world for 11 hours in a day, flee at the 12th hour into a little jealously guarded haven of refreshment from each other. "We'll go to the harbor till dark," said Ranulph, "and then we'll go to the marketplace and see the Christmas sights." Down through the twisted streets they went, Colette riding on Ranulph's back, now and then to rest her fat legs, Jacqueline and Colin chattering like magpies. Jacqueline, to whom her recent joys had come like the breaking through of spring to a little bird, seemed to have lost sight of all her fears and miseries, and chirped and hopped with an unself-consciousness akin to Peronelle's. Ranulph marveled at her. Amazing that 2 silly old nuns could have worked such a change in so short a time. Well, Jacqueline owed this to him. He felt extremely puffed up. They walked right out to the end of the pier and settled themselves in a sheltered corner where they could watch the ships. Here, out of the wind and full in the sun's eye, it was as warm as June. The island could produce days of storm unrivaled for nastiness in any other part of the world, but she could also produce midwinter days of warmth and loveliness that were like gifts of unexpected joy in old age. Ranulph, his eyes narrowed, looked from the sun-dappled waters of the harbor to the blue dome of the sky curved graciously over its glimmer, and was astounded to find himself glad to be alive. This sudden resurrection of happiness in his life was as surprising as this glowing day in the middle of winter. It was as though pink carnations had bloomed suddenly in the snow. He looked at the children grouped round him, and his eyes caressed them. He owed this flowering to them. Well, he had replayed Jacqueline. He'd repay them all before he'd done. Here his old mocking habit caught him for a moment, and he jeered at himself for a sentimental fool. He had always fled sentiment. Was it to trip him up in his old age and make a prisoner of him? Well, let it. Sentiment might be as softening to the hard iron of character as warm rain to frost-bound earth. But green things, apparently, spring from its falling. He determined then and there to have a green, if silly, old age. The children were equally happy. Jacqueline was jabbering about her Christmas presents. No one listened to her, but she didn't mind. Her talk was only her deep-charged happiness bursting to the surface in a froth of bubbles. Colette, protected against possible cold by 2 flannel petticoats and an overcoat, looked as fat and sleepy as an overfed nestling. Bunched in her sunny corner, she blinked at the sea and wondered about who knew what. Colin looked at the shipping. He was capable of looking at shipping for hours without moving. Here at the pierhead, swung out over the sea as though in the crow's nest of a ship, he could imagine himself sailing the ocean in a windjammer, and as he sat, swayed a little as though with its motion. Down in the harbor, the ships were lazy, reveling in their Christmas rest. Sails were furled, and no smoke twisted up from the funnels of the steamers. The little rowing boats along the harbor walls were empty and tethered like resting beasts in their stalls. There seemed not a soul on board any of them. The silence was absolute, and wrapped in it Colin's spirit dipped and soared in his windjammer across the free spaces of the world, until his left foot went to sleep, and the pain of it jerked him back into reality. He got up, stamped, and swore. "Colin!" rebuked Ranulph. Colin smiled sheepishly. "Why does it always make one feel better to swear?" he asked. "Because you are forbidden to do it, and freedom is your desire. The human boy invariably suffers from the delusion that to wriggle himself free of fetters is to be free." Gaped Colin. "No." Ranulph puffed at his pipe and frowned at the ocean. He had promised himself as long ago as his and Colin's visit to Mère Tangrely to enlighten Colin as to the nature of freedom, lest Colin should tread the same path as he had trod and eat the same Dead Sea apple. But the part of an instructor of youth did not come easily to him. "I must be free," said Colin suddenly and explosively, "and I must be a sailor." "Is that a free life?" inquired Ranulph. "Yes," said Colin, "of course." "Why of course? Just think, what could be more restricted than life on a ship? A ship's not large, you know. I have known men on shipboard who felt like a hyena in a cage. I felt that way myself. But one sails all round the world," objected Colin. "In a cage," said Ranulph. "But be a sailor by all means. You want freedom, and the sailor is the perfect type of a free man." "Eh? But you've just said not." "He imprisons himself that he may put a girdle round the earth. His walk is limited to the length and breadth of a narrow deck. Yet he looks from horizon to horizon, and is on nodding terms with all the stars." "Eh?" Poor Colin, admiring Ranulph and having implicit faith in his judgment, nevertheless found his arguments very difficult to follow. "You can be sure of this, my son," said Ranulph, shooting out a lean forefinger. "Whatever you want in life, you must go for its opposite. If you want riches, woo the Lady Poverty. If you want freedom, chain your body and mind to discipline. Everything goes by opposites. Take this piece of advice from a man who hasn't done it, and who therefore knows." Colin sighed. Ranulph continued, smiling sardonically at his own flights of fancy. "Yes, it's a sighing matter, my son, and difficult of comprehension at your tender age. And it's no easy matter if you long for light and glitter, to trample on the diamonds within easy reach and leap for the stars. It's so uncertain one will get there. But how explain? Hopeless. I can only sow the seed. In 10 years' time, ask your mother the meaning of the word paradox. It's an important word. Come to think of it, the Christmas legend is a paradox, if ever there was one. Who'd have thought of looking for the courts of heaven in a stable? And one day, mind you, ask your mother what your Uncle Jean did, and then don't do it." But while they talked and wondered and brooded over the harbor warmth drained from the earth, and the evening of Christmas Eve was upon them, a little flock of clouds had spread themselves in a fleecy network over the blue sky, and as the sun sank lower, they turned pink while below them the sea, reflecting the diaper of pink and blue, turning lilac color. "Look, look!" cried Jacqueline. They looked. It was an effect of light such as Ranulph, even in his travels, had never seen. Brighter and brighter shone the pink and the blue, and deeper glowed the lavender, until it was the color of a purple iris. Ranulph gaped. "The wine-dark seas of Greece," he murmured. "I never thought to see them round the island." Then, quite suddenly, the colors had gone. The sun, jealous for his treasure, would not leave them there for night to play with. He pulled them away with him over the rim of the sea, and the sky, robbed of the glory, grew pale and a little sad. The sea remembered that it was winter, and sighed a little at the sudden chill in the air. Along and down the streets of St. Pierre, the lights pricked out the twilight like pinholes in a dusky curtain. Ranulph leapt to his feet and pulled the children to theirs. "It's the 24th of December," he reminded them, "and chestnuts are to be roasted in the marketplace for your pleasure." Squeaking with delight, they ran along the pier in front of him, the little girl's tam-o'-shanters alight like holly berries, and Colin's substantial boots going clip-clop like the hooves of an impatient pony. Along the harbor wall they went, away from the hushed sea into the crowded streets. St. Pierre was now like a town of the Arabian Nights. The shop windows were aglow with color, and the streets with holiday finery. Oranges and lemons and pink hams and colored sweets, rosy faces and sailors' blue blouses, and the red caps of children. Shops and crowds together threaded ribbons of color in and out between the old gray houses, and up and down over the cobbled streets. And the houses and cobbles were not to be outdone this Christmas Eve. Lights lit behind crimson curtains, and Christmas trees set in open windows were brilliant in their gray setting. And in the crannies of the cobbles, frost fires sparkled. Like the glowing heart in a nest of colored flame was the marketplace. A great bonfire was leaping and glowing in its center, and all round it were booths loaded with oranges and apples. Hither and thither in the crowd went the chestnut men with their little red fires and iron braziers, and floating before and behind them was the delicious scent of roasting chestnuts. The crowd, laughing and joking and jostling to get to the chestnut men, was a kaleidoscope of color, shifting and changing against the orange hues of leaping fire and the dim blue of the quiet night. Ranulf, with Colette in his arms for safety, bought chestnuts for the children from a blue-bloused man with gold rings in his ears, who called down the blessings of heaven upon them, and added an extra chestnut for Colette because her eyes were blue as the Virgin's mantle. After which acts of piety, he swore horribly at a little thieving boy and made for the public house across the way. Ranulf, at this, with Jacqueline's fingers clutching rather fearfully at his hand, thought it time to make for home and glanced round for Colin. Not far from the bonfire, behind an immense pile of oranges, sat Mère Tanguy, with Colin bowing politely before her and presenting her with a wooden mouse carved by himself from a piece of driftwood. It had pink ears cut out of pieces of sticking plaster and nailed on with large black nails. Its tail was of string. Colin had taken immense pains with it and presented it to Mère Tanguy as though he were Solomon laying spices at the foot of the Queen of Sheba. Mère Tanguy took the gift in the spirit of which it was offered. It was a love gift, fashioned with care for her delight, and as such she accepted it. Her black bonnet trembled with delight as she kissed Colin, and her twinkling little eyes were moist. She swore that he was a cherub from above, and that she would keep the mouse forever. A mouse, she said, was exactly what she wanted. Her cat had killed all hers, and home, she averred, was no home without a mouse. Colin withdrew from her embrace as soon as he decently could, clicked his heels together, and bowed again. Ranulf watched over the heads of the crowd, marveled at the unself-conscious beauty of his politeness. These children, brought up in a farmhouse at the edge of the waves, companioned by birds and beasts and plants, proved that courtesy is ingrained in natural things. Even so would a wagtail bow or a dahlia pass the time of day with the wind. Imprisoned as he was in the chaste company of Jacqueline and Colette, Ranulf, to Colin's surprise, did not come to speak to Mère Tanguy, but nodded to her kindly from a distance, and called to Colin to come. Mère Tanguy nodded back, appeared to bear no ill will for this seeming rudeness. Had not the money for the rent, her Christmas present from Jean Dufroc that was, reached her by that morning's post? But Colin did not know this, and as he trotted through the crowd at Ranulf's heels, he felt a little puzzled. He felt that in courtesy Uncle Ranulf should have spoken to her. Was it because Jacqueline was there that he had not? Did even grown-up men sometimes hide their friendships from their womenkind? He wondered. He had wondered about it earlier in the afternoon when Uncle Ranulf would not take Jacqueline to La Rue Cloubon. He wondered if all this had anything to do with Uncle Ranulf's confusing talk about freedom. Uncle Ranulf said that if you wanted anything very badly, you had to look for it in the opposite direction from the natural one. It seemed natural to Colin to look for freedom in La Rue Cloubon, but was he perhaps wrong? He felt hot in the head and gave it up, but a slight seed of doubt as to the desirableness of searching for freedom in La Rue Cloubon was sown in him. Ranulf, had he known, would have slept easier that night. The fun in the marketplace was only just beginning to rise to its height and gather impetus for the raid on the public houses, when Ranulf sternly led his charges away. They must not keep their father and mother and Lupin waiting, he said, and they must go early to bed in preparation for the morrow. The children, their thoughts turning to their stockings, submitted with a good grace and followed him up the gay ribbons of the streets, and in and out the old gray brooding houses that had seen so many Christmas Eves come and go, over the old cobbles that had spread themselves through the centuries, beneath the feet of so great a multitude of children. Overhead the stars shone frostily brilliant in a clear sky, just as they had shone when the island was only a great gray rock, set in the hungry sea, and far away in Bethlehem a child was born. Colette, being the youngest of the family, was naturally the first to wake up on Christmas morning. She wriggled up from the bottom of her bed and popped her head out. It was still dark, but a faint graying where the window was gave promise of the dawn. It was very cold, and Colette, like a tortoise thinking better of it, withdrew her head and crept beneath her shell again. There, in the warm darkness, she remembered her stocking. Now that Jacqueline was growing up, Colette and Colin were the only ones of the family left to have stockings. For Rochelle had decreed that those old enough to go to early Mass should lay aside such childish things as stockings. The sucking of pink sugar pigs in the early hours of Christmas morning was, so she said, for the consolation of those who had to be kept out of mischief until their elders returned from church. When she remembered her stocking, Colette scrambled down to the bottom of the bed, dragged away the bedclothes, thrust her head out of the aperture, and grabbed it. Then she retired under cover again, hugging its delicious hard bulkiness to her bosom. She did not want to wake up Perenelle by demanding a light. So, having satisfied herself by pinching that the sugar pig was there, and the orange and the apple and the boiled sweets and the doll, she fell asleep again, clasping it to her as a mother her babe. When she awoke, it was to find Perenelle removing layers of bedclothes off the top of her head. "A Merry Christmas, darling," cried Perenelle. "How it is you don't suffocate, I don't know. And you've lain on your stocking. The doll will be all over pig." Colette sat up and hugged Perenelle. The candles were lighted, but day was faintly blue behind the curtains, and Perenelle was in her hat and coat, ready to go to Mass. Then began a frantic hubbub of Christmas hugs. Michel and Jacqueline in their coats and hats came along to kiss and be kissed. Rochelle, in her best mantle, with her prayer book in her hand, and every hair in place, sailed in to bless them. André, with his waistcoat inside out and his hair awry, rushed frantically everywhere, looking for a lost stud. Colin, in his white nightshirt, played leapfrog over the beds, and down below the back door clicked as Sophie came back from an incredibly early Mass to get the breakfast and keep an eye on the youngest children while the others went to church. At last the hubbub subsided, and Colin and Colette hung out of the window to watch the landau drive off to church in the dim, frosty dawn. Over the sea, a star shone faintly in a brightening sky, but night still clouded the land, and the landau, driving off under the trees with its swinging lamps, disappeared in a mysterious darkness. Colin stayed at the window, watching the lights disappear and listening as the sound of the wheels died away. He felt awed. The darkness that had swallowed his family held the mysteries of religion that were yet unknown to him, but known to them. Out of the darkness he felt fingers stretch and touch him, and something in him awoke and stirred a little. Colette brought him back to reality by butting him in the back. "Look," she said, pointing. "Is that the star?" Colin looked. The star over the sea was still there, though the deep blue of the sky behind it was slowly changing to a dove gray, barred with pale lemon and lavender. "It might be," said Colin, "but I don't think it's fat enough. The star in the Christmas pictures is always fat, with spokes." "Perhaps they've fallen off," suggested Colette. "If the star was new when Jesus was born, it must be very nearly worn out by this time." "Stars," said Colin, "don't wear out. They are like God, always as good as new." "My stocking!" squeaked Colette suddenly, and trundled rapidly back to her bed. Following a time-honored custom in the Dufroc family, they wrapped themselves in quilts and got into their parents' bed to open their stockings, drawing the curtains to form a sultan's tent, and sitting enthroned on the high pillows in great state. The stockings were all that could be desired. Each contained the essentials: the sugar pig, the orange, the apple, and the boiled sweets, and many delights besides, such as a doll and a miniature flat iron for Colette, a water pistol, and a sailor's whistle for Colin. They had a lovely time. They ate all the boiled sweets, except a few moist globules kept for the family, and all of the pigs except the hind quarters kept for Rochelle. Colette's pig, as Perenelle had predicted, had stuck to the doll. But it didn't really matter, and the paint from the doll's face that adhered to the flanks of the pig tasted quite nice. Colin filled his pistol with water and squirted at the picture of the Last Judgment, getting the angel with the trumpet full in the chest every time, and Colette, each time he hit the mark, blew the whistle. After an hour of this, Sophie came up, took away the pistol and the whistle, mopped up the water, and dressed them. Sophie seemed in an extremely good mood. She did not scold at all, even though the water was dripping down the Last Judgment and collecting in a pool on the floor, and she never smacked them once as she hustled them into their clothes. Her eyes were shining, her round red cheeks were redder than ever, and her stays creaked and popped like joyously tapping drums. Colette, quick to feel what others were feeling, sensed her joy. "Have you had a sugar pig, Sophie?" she asked. "Better than that," said Sophie, bursting to communicate her news, if only to the children. "I've had the offer of a husband, Holy Virgin, on Christmas morning, too." "Is that all?" said Colin, disappointed. Walking back from Mass, he popped the question, as they say in England, said Sophie, "and there I was looking in the fairy well only last night, and never saw a thing but the stars in the sky. Just shows you there's nothing in these tales." Colette, pleased but uncomprehending, put her arms as far around Sophie's waist as they would reach and kissed her. "Who popped the question?" asked Colin. "Jacquemin Gosselin," chattered Sophie. "It was that blue coat and skirt did it. All yesterday afternoon his eyes were on it." Colin politely said nothing, but he was dismayed. How are the mighty fallen? He could not believe that his friend Jacquemin Gosselin could be such an utter fool as to want to marry Sophie. He could not have seen Sophie with her hair curlers in, but it was impossible to dwell long upon depressing topics on Christmas morning. Colin was soon racing round the garden pursuing Marmalade with the water pistol, while Colette trotted backwards and forwards from the scullery to the kitchen helping Sophie. The breakfast was wonderful. Ham and boiled eggs and steaming coffee and jam and fresh rolls, and, most marvelous of all, an island specialty, the gauche de tremper, a milk cake always baked early on Christmas morning to appear on the breakfast table. Colette helped Sophie to open the oven door and take it out. Its exquisite milk-white freshness was faintly tinged with golden brown on top, and its lovely crisp smell filled the whole kitchen and floated out to greet the churchgoers as they drove into the courtyard, cold and famished. Ranulph put in an appearance at breakfast time and ate more than his fair share of the gauche de tremper, which seemed hardly fair as he had done nothing either in the way of devotions or stocking opening to warrant such an appetite. No sooner was breakfast over than it was time for church again. Andre usually escaped from a second church going on Christmas Day on the plea of the farm, but today Ranulph, with a malicious twinkle in his eye, declared himself perfectly able to do all that was necessary on the farm, in order that Andre might enjoy the felicity of accompanying his family. Rachel was grateful and delighted, and Andre went miserably upstairs to find his top hat. Later on that evening, Rachel was awakened by Perenelle, vibrating with excitement, rushing in to announce that tea was ready in the kitchen. Sophie had gone out to spend a blissful afternoon and evening with Jacquemin Gosselin, and the refreshment of the inner man was now in the hands of Perenelle and Michel. They had prepared a tea of a sumptuousness passing description. It was a proper island tea, such as they indulged in on festival days, served at twilight and combining tea and supper and the food of both. There were tea and coffee, ham and eggs, jams and jellies, and bread and biscuits, and in the middle of the table, the stupendous, mountainous, snow-white Christmas cake. The major part of the tronquet de Noël blazed in the grate, and all the holly berries were awink, and the lamps were lighted. In front of the dresser stood the Christmas tree, glimmering with candles and golden and scarlet balls, and round its feet were piled the presents. The windows were uncurtained so that as night deepened, they would be able to see the stars. Tea till bedtime was to the children the best part of Christmas Day, and to Grandpapa, Ranulph, Rachel, and Andre, vicariously young again, the hours passed with the chiming of bells that drowned the mutter of life surging past and towards them. Tea and presents and carol singing and games filled their evening brimful of delight. The sparkling kitchen shone like a glowworm in the darkness of the world all round them. Out through the windows poured the laughter and the singing and the light, conquering a little and no more out of the silence and the blackness. Now and again, as the hours passed, there would come a knocking at the hall door, and Andre would open it and find a little group of peasants standing outside, their figures grimly black against the stars. "Monsieur, alms in the name of Noël?" Sometimes they asked it in halting English, sometimes in patois that sighed in the night like music. And Andre, though he had little to give, had no business to give that little, never refused them. This house-to-house begging was an old and reverenced custom, and he was glad too, this night of all nights, that the Bon Repos hospitality should shine far, for it might be the last time. As he bade Godspeed to one little group, he stood for a moment in the darkness outside, listening to the laughter and singing, and watching the long beam of light from the kitchen window, stretching a caressing finger out across the courtyard, over the winter-bound garden, across the cliff almost to the cliff's edge. It seemed like a living thing, the radiance of something, that he and Rachel had brought to life at Bon Repos. He turned abruptly on his heel and walked in. The thought of that light quenched was intolerable. Grandpapa had gone. The clip-clop of his horse's hooves had died away in the frosty night. Ranulph had gone. The children were in bed and asleep. The little lights on the Christmas tree had died with Christmas Day, and the lamps were turned low. Only the tronquet de Noël sent out a warm crimson glow from its falling ash. Rachel and Andre, moving with the slowness of exhaustion, were trying to bring a little order into the untidy room before they went to bed. Now that the children had gone, they could hear again the mutter of life surging past and towards them, and the mutter was ominous. Where would they be next Christmas? They neither of them spoke, but the questions were there in the room with them, pressing upon them intolerably. They finished their tidying, put out the lamps, and crossed the room arm in arm, wearily. At the door, Rochelle paused. Through the window, she could see the light still shining in Renouf's room, and at the sight of it, her heart felt unaccountably lightened. She glanced round the room. The willow-patterned china and the warming pans, those incurable optimists, had each of them a little twinkling reflection of the Tronquet de Noël. To Rochelle's lightened heart, each little friendly gleam seemed a promise of yet another Christmas to come, yet another Christmas at Bon Repos. In the doorway under the mistletoe, so thoughtfully placed there by Renouf for the purpose, she turned and flung her arms round André. "It will be all right, darling," she whispered. "It will be all right." André, too, felt his heart lightened by what he considered her quite unreasonable optimism. They went upstairs, hand in hand, undressed in their candle-lit bedroom under the picture of the Last Judgment, climbed into their big four-poster, and drew the crimson curtains. The last sound they heard as they fell asleep was the murmur of the sea.